Dopamine swipe, dopamine swipe. Followers, likes, double tap. Now they control your life.
What is going on, beautiful people? Welcome back to the 817 podcast, where we talk about the lovely city of Fort Worth, Texas. We get into politics, business, culture, news. If it impacts you as a Fort Worthian, we discuss it. We do 3 short stories, 1 big story, and wins and losses every week to be your Monday morning show as you go and commute, work from home, or whatever you do to get started during the week. I hope you guys had a great Labor Day.
Are we dropping this on Labor Day? I guess Monday's a holiday, and we typically drop on Monday.
I'm actually dropping it on possibly Tuesday.
Okay.
So
you're going to have a vacation on Monday?
Yes. Yeah, my dad's in town. He brought his RV down and so he's like down the street in Arlington. So I'm going to go hang out with him on Monday.
Very good.
Yep. And I think for those of you who are listening in, I actually think this can be like an historical, important episode that when we look at the future of Fort Worth 5-10 years from now, we could actually come back to this pod and we talked about those things, because we're really talking about the future and how do we fund it and all the things that are going on. And
hopefully we'll be able to look back and say, wow, we did the right thing.
Yeah.
We had a mountain to climb. We had some, things that made it challenges before us, and we highlighted them, and those in policy-making decision seats made those right decisions, and look how much better things are now.
Correct. And so that's to me where I think this episode is really cohesive for us. Most of the time we'll have something on mercy culture, then we'll go all the way over to education, and then we'll have something about jails. But this one is, to me, all about how do we fund the future of Fort Worth when currently there's this barrier of cutting property taxes, not wanting to raise taxes, and even our schools being concerned. And also we have our leadership at the city level changing as David Cooke is retiring, and now we need to look for a different city manager. And a lot of people are wondering, how should we go with that? And so that's article number 1. Can you bring us in and tell us what we got here?
Sure. The first article is a Fort Worth Report article titled, How Will Fort Worth Find Next City Manager? Some council members call for a national search. So as we've talked about before, and as I've mentioned before, David started in the summer of 2014, which was the same time that I started. The council prior to my joining it was the council that hired them. And the only council member who remains that was in a council role for the hiring of David Cooke is Gina Bivens. And she is quoted in this article, along with a couple of others, talking about how they're going to go about finding a new city manager to take the city through this next era of growth and development while finding ways to unite city neighborhoods, which I think is a good description of what we need to be looking for. Gina points out that as we look at issues facing large cities throughout the nation, a lot of them have the same problems. Everybody is challenged with infrastructure and managing growth, and for us in Fort Worth, making people feel like they're a part of it. So I was pleased to see that the council members who are quoted in this article talk about how it's important that the citizens know what they know and how they're going about making these decisions, because they do represent us. And while it's important that they as individuals have say in this hiring, I think they need to hear from people and what their goals are for this role. And it points out, again, kind of that city manager form of government that not everybody is familiar with. People go to their council members, and their council members are the ones that are in the community. And the city manager is mainly behind the scenes, but it is a very powerful role and does have a lot of influence, because while the city council members vote on policies, it's the manager that takes whatever those policies are and makes sure that they're implemented and followed. But staff and the city manager also bring potential policies forward to the council for consideration. So it's definitely a back and forth.
And I guess, tell me, can you give me context of, this Brian Hamill from the University of North Texas quoted CEO of the city is what a city manager's role is, but the CEO of an organization is oftentimes responsible of casting the vision of where the future is going for their organization. But it doesn't seem like that's what city managers do, or at least in my time being a Fort Worth resident, I never felt like David Cooke is getting on mics to share his vision for Fort Worth. He seems like more of the COO who's operating and executing on the policies written and created by the council. So was there ever a point where David Cooke was front facing, kind of advocating his vision? Like, oftentimes people tell me, I've never had a conversation or relationship with him, but that he is about a balanced budget, but
fiscal responsibility.
And was that something that he was promoting when he was starting his posts after a decade? I came in kind of on the back half of his tenure.
Yeah, I think so, because I think we were facing a crisis with a pension that was not sustainable. And so I think I wasn't there for like the hiring and who the other candidates were. I believe that they didn't agree on a first candidate and kind of went back out and pulled more candidates in at one point. But again, I wasn't there. This is just my recollection of what people shared with me after the fact. I'm sure there's articles that we could find that would describe some of that process that happened, because I think he was also a candidate for the Dallas city manager position back in the day too, and didn't get that role, but then came in the second round of candidates that they looked at in Fort Worth and was ultimately hired in Fort Worth. But I think that the council was probably looking for someone who had that fiscal focus. And so it's a combination of them realizing what they need, finding someone who fits that bill, and then as a city manager, you kind of have to balance your own vision and ideas coming from your expertise and your experience in other places, but also you work for the council. So you're not going in there, and you have to be able to manage those relationships as well, which is also touched on in this article, that the city manager is in a position of having to manage a council that maybe doesn't always agree with each other. And in this article, they're saying a strength that would draw a lot of candidates to want to come to Fort Worth is the fact that our council, even when they disagree with each other, aren't, really hostile and terrible about it. And it's not like a horrible place to work. I mean, we've seen what happened in Dallas, where the mayor and the city manager were not aligned, and the mayor isn't aligned with many of his council members. And so they're having all kinds of upheaval, and that makes for a challenging thing. Another interesting thing in this article is talking about a nationwide search versus hiring from within. And we have had some additions to our assistant city manager levels that increase the number of assistant city managers, including putting in a role of a deputy city manager recently, who is Mark McDaniel. And that role is new but not unique to Fort Worth. We already had 5 assistant city managers. And so there has been speculation that the move of bringing a deputy in was possibly testing him out to see if he could be the city manager. I think regardless, it's important for a city of our size to do a nationwide search just to see what talent is out there. I've been impressed with Mark McDaniel and some of the things that he's been put in charge of and the results of those things. And I think he does have a focus on the city planning aspects and the managing growth and development aspects that I think are going to be so important for this next era of Fort Worth. Putting together the Fort Worth Lab, carrying forward the mayor's good-natured open space initiative. So those are all things to be considered. I was surprised that other council members didn't chime in. There's like only 3 council members that said anything in here. The one expert said that they don't believe that there'll be a shortage of qualified candidates vying for the job. Yeah. It's a job that would be appealing to people. But I don't see anybody saying they don't want to do a nationwide search. I just see the people who spoke up saying that we should, and others not chiming in at this point. But I think the one quote that I found funny was, in addition to being smart and understanding management and understanding how the city operates, they've got to be very, very smooth in handling a bunch of egos called the city council members. It takes a very skilled person. Yeah.
And that's where I think like this idea of like the CEO of the city, I just don't. It feels more of the maybe the president of the board kind of thing, or something, because like you're managing a bunch of egos and you're not necessarily touting and you're not touting your vision. You're pitting, the teams in place, and then ultimately the mayor is the CEO because they're the vision caster, they're the front facing, they're the storyteller.
Well, timing is interesting too. They're looking to do this before the elections in May. And when I first was thinking about all this, I thought, oh, well, surely they're not going to do this until after the elections in May, but he's leaving in February and they want to have some overlap.
Does that feel fast?
I don't think that it necessarily is. I think they said, like, I think in here it says a 6-month window for searching. So what is it if we count? Because I'm bad at math.
September, October, November, December, January, February.
Yeah, so we have 6 months, and that's I think they said that's a typical search time. And then I looked back to the fact that they hired David Cooke, but right before my election, but that wasn't a regular election year. That was a special election that we had because the previous council member stepped down. So he did start at the beginning of me being new on council, but it wasn't a time when like a whole bunch of people were new. And there's not usually a whole ton of turnover in even a regular election, even though all the council and the mayor is up at the same time. And people often think that that's kind of crazy because you could have a whole turnover of everybody, but that doesn't happen very often.
I'd be interesting to know where the experience comes from because Mark McDaniel's experience is a lot of Texas and a lot of different cities in Texas. But I think this person's pivotal role is a lot different if this person came from Miami or if this person came from Omaha, Nebraska. And just how their experience, so whoever this person's seat is, they're going to bring some type of legacy perspective of what a city should look like or operate like. And so this is pivotal, if this person came from Baltimore, if this person came from Phoenix, if this person comes from the West Coast, or if this person comes from the Midwest. So this can be an important role. And then like the article also shared is Fort Worth is just very in his teenage adolescence phase of deciding who it is in this new modern 21st century version of Fort Worth. And so how do they have the right people around them guiding that post? Because Fort Worth in the inside of Fort Worth, you can say things that, you still don't maybe understand all the, Cowtown, Panther City, Funky Town, even where you are in spaces and what nickname you use in the city could also dictate how much you really know. I mean, I've seen new city people come into, because I'm on that commission, our entire group in the plating is brand new. And so you can see I still don't have my cowboy boots is like a comment they'll say. And I'm like, right. And that's an example of you see Fort Worth as the cowboy town because that's who we are. But right, you don't listen to the 817 pod because, so it's all the little nuances of how do you see Fort Worth and truly understand all the sides of it.
That's why I think it could be a really interesting hiring process. And to Councilmember Nettles' point that he wants the public to know what he knows and have it be a super open and transparent process, I think that we've done hiring for much less, large roles in the city where we've had panels where you got to go and listen to the folks that were vying for that role and hear what their vision was, what their experience was. And I think if you're trying to be the city manager of Fort Worth, I love the idea of people coming in from other places and having other ideas and bringing new vision and excitement and ideas. Whenever we would go to National League of City conferences across this country in various different cities, I would be introduced to cities. I'd think, we're doing such cool things here in Fort Worth. And then I'd go to, Baltimore or Pittsburgh or any of these places that I went to these conferences where they were either doing a lot of the same things we were doing. And I was like, that's not so interesting and innovative and new. Or they would be doing interesting, new, and innovative things that we weren't doing. And that would be like, I would love us to see kind of going in that direction. Without throwing out the idea that people should have some understanding of the history here. And there is, like you said, all new people on the Plan Commission alongside you on that voluntary board. There's also a whole lot of new staff in the city of Fort Worth, new young staff. And I think a lot of them are bringing new and interesting ideas, but bumping up against and bumping into kind of lack of institutional knowledge or lack of kind of knowing where landmines exist. And I'm not saying that they should avoid those landmines. I mean, I don't want them to hit them and get blown up, but I would like them to know that they're there and be able to navigate them better.
Like one of my biggest challenges with Fort Worth is our organizations think about Fort Worth, our businesses, our schools, everyone's like very Fort Worth heavy. We're like in San Francisco, a great example is they think about how to run the world. Like those companies and those people are thinking of the globalization and be an example of how to globalize society. Where in Fort Worth, we're very much like, are you from Fort Worth? Do you show up for Fort Worth things? If you stop showing up for Fort Worth things, do you really care about Fort Worth? And that's why I think it's so hard for people out of the space, because they're coming from a lens like, yeah, I live in Fort Worth now, but I have a global perspective on how do we scale society regardless what community it's in. And I think a lot of times people will say, I mean, we're going to talk about the superintendent, right? She didn't come that far away, but I feel like she's already in the hot seat, and it's a rough battle. And I think like Fort Worth just has this thing about, do you understand us? Are you inside the room with us where we talk about Fort Worth's greatness and we are Fort Worth greatness? And if you're someone who has more of a global perspective on how you operate your life and live your life, you oftentimes
aren't listened to.
Correct.
Or included.
Yep. And I think
that
that's,
are you from here question.
Yep.
Because, and I do it too. I'm guilty of it as well. Just because, and I'm not doing it because I want to exclude someone who maybe isn't from here. I want them to integrate and become a part so that they can have their voices heard and be a part of the conversation, because I think adding that new perspective is positive and additive and something that we should be striving to do, and not keeping those voices out.
And I'll bring up some of this when we talk about education, because obviously I work in education, and I'll bring this back around because I think it's also the problem with our education situation as well. So we print pretty good on short story number 1. We still have short story number 2. There's been a lot of movement, and it seems collaboration on transportation with our mayor and Arlington's mayor. You've been at panels. So can you give us an update where we are on transit? We have 4 stories here we're trying to navigate for you all. We won't go down all of them, but we'll put them all in the notes. But can you highlight where you see transit at and the state of it in the Metroplex, and how Fort Worth is being a part of that?
Yeah, I mean, recently the mayor put together an urban rail committee, which I'm going to be serving on starting this month, September. And then there was a panel recently that talked about kind of collaboration regionally. The panel was held by the Fort Worth Report Community Conversation, and the mayor of Arlington was there, as well as Michael Morris from the Council of Governments, and our mayor, Maddie Parker, and Rich Andreski, who is the CEO of Trinity Metro. But what I found in news also this week touched on kind of, will Texas pour billions more into pointless freeway expansion that just doesn't work? And an article about DFW keeps building roads, but traffic keeps getting worse. And here's Tarrant County's most congested roads. So those are the 2 articles that kind of, for me, set the stage for why it's so important that these things that are currently happening are happening, because it's showing kind of an opening to the perspectives of the folks that are making policy decisions, to the idea that the way we've been doing things hasn't been working. Like, we might have mitigated congestion more so than we would have if we'd done nothing, but that adding lanes to highways and adding roads, regardless of if they're toll roads or free lanes or managed lanes, does not get rid of congestion. It just induces more people to drive. And when we incentivize driving and parking and all of that, we're not getting ourselves out of a situation that's going to end up being a problem in the future.
Yeah, I saw this I thought these were a good stats in one of the stories. It would take a resilient driver about 64 hours and an unhealthy doses of caffeine to drive straight from Fort Worth to Anchorage, Alaska. This is in Jamie Moore Carrillo's post. But he says that's the average Dallas-Fort Worth commuter spent roughly the same amount of time sitting in traffic in 2022. 64 hours. He then said Metroplex commuters collectively waste approximately 217 million hours, or 24,784 years of their life waiting out delays that year. So a bunch of interesting stats on how literally time has increased of us sitting in in 1980 it was 36 hours of wait time on traffic and roads, and now we're up to 64 hours. That's really serious.
And when people are driving and they say things like, oh, well, Fort Worth is pretty good because I can get across town in this many minutes or that many minutes, I think a lot of the time they're deluding themselves that they can't really get across town as quickly as they maybe think they can in their mind. For years in Fort Worth, I could get from one side of Fort Worth to the other side of Fort Worth in 10 minutes, no problem. If I left my house with 10 minutes, I could get where I needed to go pretty much anywhere in Fort Worth. And now, especially if I'm going to the north side or to the east side, it's a good 20 minutes. And so it's doubled. But people have kind of just buried their heads in the sand and been like, oh, it's still not quite that bad. But this article points out that it is pretty bad, and especially if you're getting on highways. I, for one, avoid highways at all costs because I hate them. They're terrifying. We're raising our speeds on them through urban areas, which is even more terrifying. And I don't know if it's just because I'm sensitive to it and it shows up in my algorithm, but I feel like we have had so many more tragic crashes on our highways recently where first responders have died, other people have died. And, you know, that doesn't even go back to the whole statistic that on Texas highways since the year 2000, there has not been a death-free day since November 7th of the year 2000. So clearly we need to be looking for other ways to handle that. And so these first two articles are very much about how the congestion is getting worse, how adding more lanes to freeways doesn't fix that. And the second two articles, Tarrant leaders to discuss growing transit needs as the population swells, is a Fort Worth Report article. And for Tarrant County to succeed, leaders say that they need cooperation, state funds for transit, are the second two articles that I think are positive signs that what many of us have been saying for a long time are now kind of sinking in for some folks that are making some of these policy decisions. But by no means does this mean that it's going to be an easy journey, because there are still people who are perfectly comfortable behind the windshield and the wheel of their car, and they don't see themselves ever getting on any kind of public transportation. And I think in the past, we've also focused a whole lot on, okay, well, if we can't provide public transportation access to the entire city, then we should, you know, it has to be equally provided to everybody in the entire city. And that's not realistic either. You got to look at land use and population and density and see areas that are servable by transit and serve those areas that way. And that alleviates congestion for people, even the people who are never going to get on transit.
It was interesting to see how people in that panel were talking about transit. Where some were even talking about their like Uber city thing that they have in Arlington. So they were talking about all different types of transportation, and
even our transit authorities are, yeah. I still think I agree that we need to look at technology to fix some of the issues, but I don't think that relying completely on technology, you know, that whole it's going to be the Jetsons someday and we're all going to be flying around in our own individual air taxis, I don't think is a solution. I think that on-demand and zip zone type of service is a good augmentation to a robust fixed rail or fixed route service that is able to carry a higher occupancy than what even just those on-demand cars can do, because those are little minivans that can pick up more than just you know, you can have multiple people in there, but it's not a bus and it's not a train. So I think I'm glad to see Arlington is on board for high-speed rail. I think that that's going to be a collaborative thing that will be beneficial to all. I don't mind the offering of an on-demand type of service to augment a transit authority's other offerings, but I think that not having any kind of bus or rail and trying to rely completely on those on-demand services is
I need
not
to send you a picture of
thing.
when I was in Phoenix last week. There is a ton of Waymo cars, and they're just all around. And it's and I know the Waymos and the Teslas. Like, I know Elon Musk and Tesla always he says your car is eventually going to be something that makes you money, because it'll naturally drop you off of work, but then can drive and pick up people while you're at work and make sure to be back. So he talked about how your car won't sit in park unless you're charging or at home. But you can have it out on the road, and I find that it seems that that's another thing that it's coming in society. So it's like I feel like the battle of cars is now going to be the battle of these automatic cars kind of becoming Ubers without the Uber driver, and people are just using those cars one day. And I'm talking, not anytime soon, but it's happening. And you need to go to Phoenix, and I'm talking about I in 3 days saw 50 Waymo cars.
I've seen 50 and 2, but they were all in a parking garage in Austin waiting to be deployed, and I don't think they ever got deployed.
Yeah. And it was, and I know some of the people I was with took the Waymo back to the airport. And they said, yeah, it was really cool, and there was no one in it. And I think it's crazy that that's another thing that hasn't hit Texas yet, but I see it happening in other cities like San Francisco. So we're going to have to see that as well. But the one thing I want to say before we leave this story right here about this panel, the mayor said, and I don't know what the interpretation was, but the mayor said.
Which mayor?
Maddie, our mayor. Mayor Parker said by 2100, the Parker County city of Aledo, currently home to more than 5,800 residents, will be the population center of the Fort Worth, Dallas area, the mayor said.
Yeah, you and I were trying to look at a map and figure out what was meant by that. And I think that in looking at the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, the fact that Fort Worth has so much land still available in Tarrant County and in Parker County, available to develop, not necessarily saying that I think it all should develop, because that could be a bad thing. But if growth continues to grow to the west, that we could have increases in population that make that shift the center of growth. But you were pointing out that there's so much going on up in north of Dallas, that you don't think that's ever going to be able to shift that far to the west.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should want it to shift that far to the west.
Yeah, I think this is a horrible vision if this is what she believes that how we should build.
I think she thinks it might happen with unmitigated growth. But
yeah, I can't tell if this is a positive vision or she's like, hey, based off of data, this is what I think is going to happen.
I think it could. But I think that the people who have chosen to live in West Fort Worth, who are looking for that little bit more room around them and not wanting the population density that you maybe have in an urban core, are going to fight it with everything that they have. And so every time anybody proposes to build a subdivision that has smaller lot sizes than what they have, like on their acre-sized lots, they're going to fight against that. And so,
because I would argue today's center of the Metroplex, you have to count in Collin County, and you have to count in Frisco, and you have to count in McKinney and Prosper and Aubrey and all that stuff that's happening up there. The center of the Metroplex now has gone more north than it has gone left or right. So now, like, if Arlington back in the day was the middle of the Metroplex of Fort Worth and Dallas, the middle now is probably Grapevine. Like, that's the center now. And it just went north. And so even if it starts moving west, it's more North Fort Worth that would be the center. Anyways, I just thought that was a fascinating
I think it's mainly highlighting
quote.
The fact that we have so much developable land in the city limits of Fort Worth, which could have some more infill in a way that would be a better form of development than the far-flung sprawl that we have had up to this point to both the north and to the south. So I think the goal would be to not have that happen to the west. And, your Walsh ranches are kind of a planned development that include more than just single family subdivisions. And so with the addition of UTA West out there, with the addition of schools and places to shop, you have the things you need out there. So then maybe those people don't necessarily have to get on I-30 and come into town or get on I-20. And so the call that, oh my gosh, this is going to add so much more traffic and so much more people on the road, and it's that we need to widen all these highways, in my opinion, is not true. If those people do need to come into the core of the city, then we should be offering other modes of transportation to get them there. So back to the comment I made when UTA West was announced, that we should be looking at some kind of rail in the I-30 corridor coming from the west, so that people have those other options and then they're not all getting in cars. And I had a couple of people asking about the panel and whether there was any kind of concrete call to action or steps that could be moved forward. And I feel like there was. There were a couple of people who were there who made responses to this question on somebody's social media post about the panel that, there wasn't really. But I think there seriously was. I think these were two elected officials who have kind of stuck their neck out there a little bit and said that they understand that the way that we have done transportation in the past is not a sustainable way to do it in the future, and that they see the need to support other types of transportation. But our legislature at the state level has put some serious restrictions on the funding that they have, and some of that funding comes from the federal government too and goes through the state. And so they have restricted what we can do with that money. And there was a cartoon I saw recently that showed a huge pipeline of water going into the mouth of highways. So TxDOT, all this funding going into TxDOT, and it's restricted to just highways and improving highways. And a tiny little trickle is dripping out before it hits the mouth of the highway into the mouth of transit. And that is something that we would need to have addressed at the legislative level. So these two local electeds are saying we need to be working together regionally, we need to be cooperating with each other, and we need to approach our state and federal funds in a different way and look at the fact that, you say this is so expensive. And so then people just stop. They say, oh, rail's expensive. Public transportation is expensive. We don't want to subsidize it. But if you look at the dollars in the article that talks about how much we've poured into highway expansion and how it has not gotten rid of any kind of congestion, we're still just holding steady or going back to being just as congested as we were and will get more congested as this growth continues. We subsidize all our transportation options. Your car is definitely subsidized. Free parking is subsidizing your driving. Yeah. So we've got to have a different bent on this, a different look on this, a different perspective. And our electeds are asking for us to show up and support this new way of looking at transportation in Tarrant County.
Well, I appreciate the constant analysis, but I actually agree with you. This feels like an exciting time when, two mayors are putting their neck out there for the state and saying, hey, let's make transit happen. So we'll see what continues to go from here. We're going to move into our third story, all right, when we talk about growth. So we talked about the city manager, we talked about transportation, but obviously with growth equals more jobs, equals more economic opportunity, and those economic opportunities are available if more people in our city are educated and have a good education system. So we also had, while we were out, is that the city leaders, which led by Mayor Maddie Parker, publicly pushed the board meetings to do more, and that we needed to do more. She wrote a letter and had 50 other leaders sign off to that letter that we need bold, unified approach to the district. And this message and this action shows that the Fort Worth ISD must be in a dire situation where the mayor, who doesn't have any responsibility to the school district or any responsibilities and actions of managing it, to have this letter written and say, we, Fort Worth ISD, have to do better. And data shows that Fort Worth ISD, when you look at other districts with over 20,000 students, of the top 20 of those 25 districts like ours, we are number 23 on performance. We're only 25%. One of every four student met grade level requirements on the 2024 standardized tests. And so this is kind of the charge that happened. And basically where we are now is that it seems like Fort Worth ISD is committed to working with city leaders. There's also been, what I see here is a transition of who the president of the board is. It's now Roxanne Martinez, who took over the gavel at Tuesday's meeting, and that's going to be interesting. Which I think Roxanne Martinez is the greatest angel that has existed in Fort Worth ISD, and the fact that she loves her community and loves the city, that's a great step that has happened. Nothing against the person before, but I think this person is going to be a great fit for this next chapter. What is your interpretation, right? If this would have happened to you while you were on city council and the mayor says, hey, I'm going to write a letter to tell the ISDs to do better, and then sit with them at the board meeting and sit with the superintendent and say, we got to do something. What's your kind of take of how you would looked at it and manage this situation?
So I think while I was on council, there was a lot of conversation about how people would complain to the city about everything that was not going well or right within the city, as if it was all on the city's plate to take care of it. And as you pointed out, the city of Fort Worth doesn't control the independent school district. The Fort Worth ISD is the Fort Worth Independent School District. But we do try to work together with the districts that are in the city limits of Fort Worth. And there are 14 of them, just to be clear. There's not just Fort Worth ISD. And we did try to look into having scheduled regular meetings with the various ISDs where the council would get together with them. But that is a lot of meetings to try to coordinate. And I don't think that you can necessarily have one-on-one meetings with the whole city council and all of these various school boards, or even Fort Worth ISD on a super regular basis. So each of those organizations, I know the city of Fort Worth has a liaison that focuses on education. And so I think there are ways to do this. And I think that our mayor in this instance has a very strong focus on improving education, and various roles that she played prior to her current role as mayor highlight that. She was one of the initial leaders of Tarrant To and Through after she left the position that she had as the chief of staff for mayor and council at the city of Fort Worth. So I know that this is something close to her heart, and I know that she believes truly in trying to work together to support education in Fort Worth. So this letter that she wrote had a lot of leaders sign on to it. I mean, it was like 40 leaders, and a bunch of those people showed up at the city council meeting prior to the school board meeting and said some of the same things that were in this letter. So I think that this was a coordinated effort amongst all of these people prior to them showing up at the school board meeting and making these comments public and putting this letter out to everyone.
And of the letter, it says Fort Worth ISD must urgently adopt a governance model that drives a clear, actionable turnaround strategy with measurable outcomes. 1, develop clear and ambitious goals focused on student achievement was 1. Align the goals with budget priorities informed by thorough audit. 3, implement high-quality instruction across every classroom. 4, prioritize academic interventions for students who are falling behind. 5, conduct a complete comprehensive personnel audit, implement targeted evaluation plans, and develop compensation programs that support and retain top educators. And 6, pause any further bond expenditures until a thoughtful district facility plan is developed that enhances teacher capacity and student resources. She also talks about having bold vision and innovating and having a unified approach. Now, what's fascinating, this podcast, I am known more in Fort Worth because of this podcast than what I do for work. And, I run an education company that provides after-school student support services to students via their electronic devices. So basically, we say that student support services shouldn't only be available during the day when kids are in class. That would be like the grocery store only open when teachers are at work. We know that out-of-school barriers and challenges impact in-school success. So how do we help school districts go from blockbusters to Netflix to meet this student-centered, phone-based generation so that they can actually get the help they need? We have serviced over 400 schools in 23 states, and we have over 50,000 kids active on our platform. Now, I have worked all across this country, from Clark County, Philadelphia ISD, and I've actually worked with superintendents who have been let go because mayors actually have the power to fire the superintendent. And so, now let's be clear here. I started this company in 2014 at Tech Fort Worth. So shout out Tech Fort Worth for, helping me start my idea. Now, I don't work in a single school or a single student in Tarrant County of Fort Worth ISD. So there's an interesting dynamic there where you've grown one of your own and everything you talk about in entrepreneurship that you want to then in 2023 be one of the only 13 Inc. 5000 companies that were on the list for the fastest growing companies in America. So I have a very interesting dynamic with the city about education. And I, going back to what we were talking about, have a global mindset. I am not trying to create a solution that's just for Fort Worth. I believe the entire public education system is massively behind on how we need to support these digital native students and where the world is going. And so I felt like I had a lot of other modern visionary groups and district leaders to see what we were doing to support what we do. Now, Fort Worth ISD in this whole issue and I've always tried to keep this podcast separated from business and my personal life, because the political ideas and the things I say here isn't a representation of everyone else in our company. Most of them don't even know I do this podcast. And so this podcast I record on Sundays. I do this on Sundays. I don't promote it. That's why people always wonder, why don't you talk more about your podcast? Why don't you see it on social media? It's because I have a bigger vision and a bigger thing that I'm working on that's bigger than this podcast and what I have to say about Fort Worth. But for this situation, I think I go back to what I always talk about, and it's a lot of what I see the problem with education and the challenges goes back to how we act and operate. What I would have loved to see rather than a letter, not just a letter, and trust me, I think Fort Worth ISD is massively broken and massively it has a lot of issues. Again, I'm not working here not because my idea is not a good idea. I'm not working here because Fort Worth is stuck in 2004. And so what I think is like the challenge here is I saw this letter happen while I saw a lot of those people who wrote that letter not sending their kids to public school. A lot of them were first day at Trinity Valley. And so how powerful would have been if we actually put our kids in these schools and put our parental energy into making these schools better, because as the top class parents, we're no longer running away from the problem and taking our kids out of the situation. And so those are things that like we have to always understand our own actions that impact why schools are bad. And we have to understand like another great example is paying teachers, right? We don't pay teachers a livable wage so that more talented people like myself who would have never chose to try to start a business idea if teachers were paid six figures. I would be happy to be a teacher if it was a six-figure salary.
You'd be a great teacher.
Yeah. Oh, I would have crushed it. But because of those situations. So like we have to accept those things and our actions. And I think that's where I get agitated about when people talk about education, is because it's always pointing out to the people who are in the war. And like we're all sitting on the side able to separate ourselves from the problem, and rather than getting our hands dirty within it. And that's why I've been in 800 schools in 46 states. I've been in these tough schools. And what I see is that a lot of people just like, that's why you see when you look at research that is successful, it's grit research, resilience research. It's research on the individual. How do you teach kids to have more grit and resilience, rather than how do we see the other data that shows that when rich people interact with poor people do better. But our whole society is bit on classism and separating poor kids from rich kids. And the data shows the number one thing over school, over good parents, is economic connectedness and the interconnectedness of people. And so those are big things. The other big story that's going to be the big story is how do we fund? And now that we have TAD, why didn't we write a letter to TAD and the appraisal district for now having a situation that could defund more Tarrant County schools? So it's just like those are the things that like we have to lead by bold action rather than just telling them these are the things we think they should do.
Yeah, and I tend to not speak up. I mean, you just described why you have kind of not been actively voicing things here locally about the schools here. And, I am one of those parents that chose a different path for my kids as opposed to public school. I came from a combination of both public and private schools that my parents helped start, and going to public school as well, and then going to private school for high school. My husband has a combination of public and private in his background. And for our kids, we chose private school. And so I tend to be hesitant to chime in on what I think is wrong and with what I think the solutions are. And I have many friends that teach in Fort Worth ISD and are leadership in Fort Worth ISD and serve on school board. And so I would love to give them the opportunity to speak. And so I think we are going to have some folks come and be guests on the pod to hopefully hear some of those voices and look for solutions.
What I think would be really helpful is a letter to the TAD board saying, we don't agree with these property value things because it's going to impact our schools and the funding that they get.
Well, and the fact that our schools, like you were saying, that we have the whole process separates the haves and the have-nots. Yeah. The schools that are doing well and have robust parent support are in neighborhoods where the property values are high. And so that limits who can live there, that limits who can go to those schools. And so that just continues to exacerbate that separation that you just pointed out, that continues to make the kids that are from low income families suffer even more.
So like you said, we are going to have people in the education space on this. Steer Fort Worth, when you did that panel on transit, asked me to be on the panel for education. I was already out in Clark County doing school work, so I wasn't even in town. But yeah, I think that we will continue to see this. I agree, and I actually applaud the mayor for writing the letter to Fort Worth ISD. I think Fort Worth ISD, I have been through enough school districts to be clear that Fort Worth ISD needs a massive transformation and turnover. And I think they're doing a lot of the hard work right now of cleaning out the closet, getting things more healthy. There's people there. What's funny, there's people that are no longer there who I remember being the gatekeepers of, I was pitching the idea to, who were the college access people, who were the people who, like, they saw me growing. They saw what I was doing, and there is no chance of them ever starting what we were doing. But again, that's one example, but Fort Worth ISD needs this kind of kick in the butt. I just also think that we have to understand how we participate in communities, capitalism, and culture impacts also why our schools are the way they are. And
in my experience, the teachers are doing some really hard work. So
yeah,
we're not making commentary on 100%. What teachers are doing.
It is not the teachers and it's not the students. Those are the least problems. Those are the greatest two parts of school. It's everything around school funding. It's around the politics. It's around how we also have to be honest with our society that education, one of every 20 person who has a job works in education in America. So if if half of your budget goes to people who are not in the classroom, who gets to sit in an office and talk about social emotional learning strategies, I'm not saying that's not important, but you have a lot of people sitting in a district office that are not front-facing teachers. And I think how we look at that, education is going through what Blockbuster went through, what Kmart went through, what what's the other ones? Movie theaters are going through. We're realizing that the printing press went through. Things are having to get more consolidated because we're also having less kids enrolled due to simply the population decline. I saw a stat on a Wall Street Journal article, and it said 35% of 50 to 90-year-olds do not have grandchildren. 35%. That's a pretty high number.
I'm in that category.
Yeah, right? Right? So good thing for my brother, my parents aren't in that category. But this also is going to become where funding is not even just going to come from an issue. Like if it's by per pupil is going to change. And if we're anti-immigration and all that stuff, more and more of these kids are becoming Hispanic. And that's the other part of this whole literacy thing.
They are Hispanic.
Yeah.
Become Hispanic.
Yeah. More and more of our classrooms are becoming majority Hispanic. The 0 to 5, if you look at just 0 to 5 in Texas, the majority of kids are Hispanic. The majority of Texans are Hispanic, 0 to 5. And so that is also changing, where I also think, how do we measure literacy when I would argue that we are now living at a time where more 9-year-olds know 2 languages? Right? Exactly. So it's like, why don't we measure that? Okay, yeah. So there's just like this culturally that we also have to question, are we really measuring everyone at the correct space on literacy? Because literacy is changing possibly in America, where how language is being spoken. And I think a lot of these kids are smart and intelligent and just come from different spaces. And so I also think like we can't measure them like, oh, our literacy rates in 1995 were this. But yeah, everyone spoke English. And that was what happened. Now today, there's tons of different languages being spoken. And so it's going to be a little harder. And they also showed the districts here where Fort Worth is at the number 23 out of 25, where 1 in every 4 kid is at grade level. The ones at the top, I'm going to say the 5 schools at the top: United ISD, I never learned how to say this ISD, Salida ISD, Galena Park ISD, La Jolla ISD, and Brownsville ISD. I'll keep going. Idea Public School ISD, Laredo ISD, Edinburgh ISD, Far San Juan LSISD, Houston ISD. So Houston is the first one I get to before I can tell you that there's a monolith of student body. 90% of those kids in the 9 ISDs I just said, 90% are Hispanic. And so when you take in the amount of diversity in the palette of these Houston ISDs, Fort Worth ISDs, the Irving ISDs, the Arlington ISDs that are at the bottom of the list, the need is not as cohesive. So these rates are even harder to get up because it's not that 90% of our kids are Hispanic. We have a black population that's very large. We have all these refugees coming from other places involved in here. And so, like, I understand saying that we're not doing as good as La Jolla or Brownville, but that is a competitive advantage to hit literacy rates when the majority of kids are all in the same kind of cultural, ethnic world view and guide at home. And so I also think it misses the melting pot challenge that Fort Worth has compared to the other ISDs that we're comparing them to. So this allows us to now go into how our schools are not being funded. Transit has been funded on streets, and now we have a seat at the city budget. This leads us to the big story, and that big story is what do we do to fund the future if everything is about lowering property taxes?
So at the beginning of this pod, we talked about how the title of this pod was going to be, How Do We Fund Fort Worth's Future with Less Taxes? And this touches on the school situation that we were just discussing in short story number 3. And our first article in this big story section is A Shocking Lack of Understanding. TAD Deliberately Defunded Schools, Districts Say. So the Tarrant Appraisal District Board of Directors has deliberately jeopardized school funding when it approved changes that affect property valuations, according to a letter signed by 9 school board presidents. Board members also displayed a shocking lack of understanding regarding school funding laws when they finalized sweeping changes to the county's reappraisal plan. So we touched on this previously, where they put a cap on appraisals and they went to an every other year evaluation thing, which basically locks in evaluations. So if they were evaluated too low or too high, too low, leads to not enough taxes to run schools, and too high leads to property taxpayers paying higher taxes for 2 years instead of just 1 year, because they won't be reevaluated again for another year. And I think they even put language in there that said that even in kind of extreme situations, you can't go back and do a revaluation in the off evaluating year. So they've really locked this stuff in. And I think that the school districts are now coming forward and basically saying that this is going to have a negative effect on school funding. And I think the board is saying that it was unintentional, but the school districts are thinking that it was kind of intentional.
Yeah, and that's where because Tim O'Hare is obviously on the extreme and on the right politically, and so where the state and the voucher program is the priority for the governor, and he's really doing all he can to make that happen, so much of pitting campaign dollars against other Republicans who vote against his voucher. And so you can argue that this is, what they're saying in this letter is that you can argue that this was a strategy and a win-win for Tim O'Hare, because not only is he lowering property taxes for his constituents, he is also gutting his schools with budget, which ultimately allows for room and play for the voucher program to maybe be more supported long term. So I can totally see this. And there was one article where it said Arlington ISD's superintendent wasn't on board to say those things, but now the article by Emily Wolf kind of makes it sound like Arlington's joining Fort Worth's protests. I don't know if it's that same letter.
Well, they list in the letter, they break down how much each signatory district is estimated to lose. And Fort Worth ISD is estimated to lose $45 million, which is a huge amount of money.
And the superintendent at Arlington said he would be more reluctant to disapprove the appraisal district's budget if they had given school district concerns adequate consideration. about 44% of the property tax by Arlington ISD are residential. Of those, 16% are residential properties without homestead exemptions, whose values would stay flat until 2027. That flattening will impact both the state property value study, which dictates how much money schools receive, and Arlington ISD's tax rate. If the appraisal district property value estimates differ significantly from the state's estimates, districts like Arlington could see massive funding cuts. Also goes into say stagnant property values could also push the district to increase its interest and sinking or its I&S rate, the portion of their overall property taxes that goes toward making annual debt service payments. And so when you look at the Tarrant County school districts that can be impacted at the I&S tax rates, 3 area school districts are already at the maximum allowed I&S rate to pay for bonds for construction of school facilities. So there's no room to continue to use tax dollars to pay down these debts. So this district's worry property stagnation will end their bond projects and fund those projects that it already voted on. So, yeah, I this just kind of goes back to the whole thing that we're talking about is why is there not a letter to this? If there's a letter to literacy, there has to be, because of poor literacy performance in Fort Worth ISD, there has to be a letter to TAD about not supporting this. Fort Worth is half of the population of this county. Get together, and if you really want to help Fort Worth ISD out.
Well, there may be a letter coming because Fort Worth is going into their budget cycle right now. And the first thing that's already happened is that in order to meet the obligations that the city manager identified in this upcoming budget, he told the council at one of the first budget meetings that we were going to need to raise the tax rate. And so I think some of that comes from these lower property valuations that are impacting the school district are also going to impact the city. So the Fort Worth mayor and council members united against raising the city's property tax. So our city manager basically came in and said, in order to deliver this budget, which has all the things in it that you all have identified as priorities, which is an increase in the amount of money that goes towards fixing our infrastructure, our roads, all these different things, and also taking over the EMS, MedStar is going to add something to the budget that wasn't there before. And there's several other things. He said, we can't do it unless we raise the tax rate. And I think I made a snide comment the last time we talked about this about, oh, who didn't see this coming?
Yeah.
As we continued to lower the tax rate beyond the need that was imminent years ago to not be the highest tax rate in the entire state. We were the city with the highest tax rate, and now we are not. We are far below it. But we continued to cut it and cut it and cut it, sometimes 3 and 4 cents in 1 year. And in those times, there were, in 2017, when we were talking about transportation and the need for funding for transportation, I floated the idea of putting a penny of that property tax towards transportation. And that didn't happen because 2 colleagues of mine refused to show up for a meeting where 5 of us had voted to have a discussion about it. And so we were able to schedule that meeting, but then 2 colleagues decided they just didn't even want to have the conversation. So they just didn't show up at the meeting. There was no quorum. We had to not have the meeting. So we couldn't even have that conversation. So hopefully we can have conversations going forward. But they're now uniting around this idea that they don't want to raise the tax rate. And I don't blame them. Nobody in elected office wants to be in elected office when you're raising the tax rate. That is not a thing that you want to have to say before going into an election, which is in May. And so I get it, but what's going to get cut? Because they're saying, we want you to not raise the tax rate, but also provide all the things that you said you're going to provide. And if you go through the list of things that could be in jeopardy, many of them are things that we've been touting as good things that we've been doing, identifying neighborhoods that were underserved for years and years and years and putting infusions of support into those neighborhoods. That's probably, hopefully not going to be on the line because that's been something that people have pointed to as being a thing that we are doing better now. But they're asking for a budget to be delivered with no increase in tax rate and no taking away of any of the things that are currently in the budget. And that's just not possible.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how they're going to accomplish that.
And you just mentioned how Fort Worth has all this land and all these, we're unlike other cities where we have a sprawl I said this probably 2 pods ago, where our suburbs is a part of our city, where the suburb doesn't create its own new, right? Plano's its own city, Addison its own city, but our Addison and our Plano are still a part
In
of the
Fort
city.
Worth.
And so we actually should have higher taxes because we have more to build, because we have more land to service, and a lot of that land is net new roads, new houses, new utilities. And so we actually should be having bigger budgets than Dallas, unless we're going to exile some part of our land so that they can create their own tax program for the Alliance, and it's Alliance Texas now. And you do that.
Yeah, but then you would lose all that tax, and that is
Yeah.
one that has a higher tax rate
Yeah.
because there is a commercial
Yeah.
concentration
And that's-
there. What is causing the problem is the development that doesn't pay for itself, and that is single-family homes in the middle of nowhere that then have voters in them that insist on services at the level that they would get if they were in closer to the core of the city where we already have those things.
And I'm glad you said that, because you're right. Like Dallas, the competitive advantage we have in Fort Worth is Dallas isn't. We think Dallas is competing with Fort Worth. Dallas is competing with Frisco and all the businesses up there, and right, Jerry Jones moving there. All this is Dallas is competing with Frisco, and that's what would happen if Alliance Texas existed. Alliance Texas would be our Frisco. Now Fort Worth is losing to its suburb city, and so it's a competitive advantage that we don't have to stress about competing against our own suburbs. But that means we then have to fund our tax system so that those places can still be competitive, like and flourish like Frisco. If those suburbs are gonna flourish like Frisco, it's now on to the city to fund that growth and support those communities as a part of Fort Worth cities. And that's so we're stuck in this cutting property tax stuff, when I just think Fort Worth is, I don't know if we'll ever get over that message.
We would constantly hear electeds saying that they hear that the number one thing that the citizens want is to lower their taxes. And I think that if we're honest with people about what it costs to provide the services that they also espouse as being very important to them, I mean, they're constantly asking for these services as well. So why do we get so hung up on the tax rate question and think that's the most all being important thing to people? And then we also shoot ourselves in the foot by constantly saying, we have such a reliance on property tax. And so that burden falls upon those property owners. But then we do things at the state level that basically says, oh, we'll never have an income tax in Texas. And so then they just cut off that source of ever even considering that. And I think I'm not saying I want an income tax on top of the high property taxes that we already have. But why say absolutely we can never even consider various other options when we constantly find ourselves in this position of having people be upset at the high property tax that they have to pay? And, some people's solution is that government shouldn't be doing any of these things and that we should just cut it down to the bare basics and not have government funding or supporting anything besides just the bare minimum of public safety, roads, water, trash pickup, all that kind of stuff. I tend to think that one of our main goals is making the quality of life here higher. And I don't think you can have a higher quality of life without supporting some of those other things.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because it almost feels like for the last 30 years, through this like internet boom, more wealth was created and more new wealth was created. And we lived in this like free marketplace where like valuations of companies and wealth soared. You look at the salaries of CEOs, you look at how these people like get rich off of tech companies, and the stock market really has like crushed over these 30 years. And it now feels in a way that like schools and education and government is now realizing that a lot of this fake value, and these companies, I think companies are really beat down. I mean, without those top 7 companies, everyone else is pretty beat down. No one's really hiring. Maybe this is just a turn of like a part of our history where the next 10 to 20 years, hopefully not that long, but it's just going to be a tough time where everyone's getting honest about money And so there's, it's just going to be a tough time. And maybe this like gutting of what, like basically Michael Crane says, and he, he thinks there needs to be, and there needs to be more done to comb through the budget. That maybe we're just going to get a lot of people unemployed and a lot of firings and a lot of questions of what do we need, and we're going to get things down to the bare bones.
We already are, though.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I have said multiple times that we have not been staffed to the level that is necessary to provide proactive planning and neighborhood engagement and services to neighborhoods and all the services that I think are vital, important services for a city to be a thriving place since the recession of 2008. We never, even after the recovering from the recession, and the recession wasn't even as bad for us as it was for some other cities that didn't have kind of some of the resilience things built in. Like, one article we didn't touch on that I sent you earlier is about the Barnett Shale. There's a series going to be in the Fort Worth Report, and they've done the first article on it about what the Barnett Shale brought to Fort Worth with fracking, and that the recession didn't hit us as hard because of that. But then this series is going to go into some of the unintended consequences, which I'm excited to see, because I had some very serious opinions about fracking and urban drilling in Fort Worth, and I think it had some consequences that we're now living with. But even with the recession not affecting us as negatively as it did other places, and our ability to recover from it, we still didn't staff up to the level that a city of our size needs. And had we done that, we probably would have had to cut a bunch of people when we started trying to cut that tax rate the way we did. And still, every year, we have things that we all identify as being important that need additional funding. Transit in Fort Worth gets half per capita of the funding of other cities of our size. $100 per capita in Fort Worth, $200 per capita in comparable cities that have more robust transit. Yeah. So where is that money going to come from?
Well, quote from Michael Crane, I think I've been clear over the last several years. I've not voted for the tax rate because I've not believed that the city management has scrubbed the budget as best as they can.
Well, I would like to see him point to the things that he thinks need to be scrubbed then.
And that's what's going to get, like, if Maddie isn't going to run, it's probably, if she does run, it's probably going to be her last run. And I think I hope she just realizes that we got to get away from this old story of lower property taxes. Of course, older people who are on a fixed income who vote, who want that, but that's not what the future of Fort Worth needs.
Well, I think vulnerable people need to be protected in some way. And I think there are tools that you can put in place to alleviate concerns of displacement of older people as, their fixed incomes dictate their inability to pay rising taxes as improvements occur around them. I think we definitely need to look at putting those kind of tools in place. Yeah. But I don't think it should be across the board for every single person. When I was approached about would I be willing to pay a fee that would go into improving my roads, and that fee would work out to be like $12 a month or $7 a month, I was perfectly happy to do that. Yeah. With taxes going up, if it said that the difference is like, in the hundreds of dollars a year, that is not something that is going to break my budget. But it is something that could break the budget of some people. And so I'm not trying to be cavalier about the people that would struggle with that.
I do agree with Crane that there is a part of the budget he can scrub if he looked at it, and that's police. So he should really look into that part because that's where most of it goes.
So whenever anybody even brings that topic up, what happens is you get accused of wanting to defund the police.
Yeah.
And that literally is not what you're calling for.
No.
It's a reallocation. And it's because, similarly to teachers, we have asked our police officers to do a whole lot of things that maybe are not in the realm of what they're trained and highly skilled and capable of doing.
Yeah.
And so when I hear people talking about how police have to deal with, the unhoused, and police have to deal with the people who are struggling with mental illness, those are all things that maybe should be dealt with by other professionals and not a police response. And so it's not a matter of defunding the police. It is a matter of putting the funding to the professionals that are better equipped to do that work.
Yeah, and like schools,
and not ask the police to do that work anymore.
Yeah, and like schools, police also have when I talk about the blockbuster issue, there's a lot of middle managers and people who get to sit in AC who no longer go out and do the work of the police, the frontline teacher of the police force, where they have 200 spots open or something crazy like that.
And for example, the crime prevention and control district that was put in place in the 80s was in response to a high crime spike, and Fort Worth had a bad reputation based on some very high crime stats that were happening. And that was to go towards crime prevention. And then it just basically morphed into just being a part of the police budget. But it still has an element of it that's supposed to be for crime prevention with partner agencies that are doing other types of work. But from my understanding and looking at that, some of those partner agencies are required to already have some kind of ongoing relationship with the police department. And I'm saying some of this work should be done by completely different people besides people who might have a relationship with the police. And I think that's just something to consider, and without having somebody attack me and saying I'm anti-police, because I'm not. Yeah. And the other question with the CCPD is it used to get voted on every 5 years. And while I was on council, it got changed to being voted on every 10 years because the staff came to the council and they said this passes overwhelmingly every single year. So why do we need to have an election on it every 5 years? And I said, well, because maybe these crime stats change and other cities put a whole cent towards transportation. And I would like to see us have the ability to do that if in the future that money is not as necessary for crime prevention.
Yeah.
But that did not pass. And I was probably thought of as being a defund the police person.
There's so many sacred cows in Fort Worth. And I mean, it feels like the next recession, whenever it is, it's going to be based on the people who were able to transform from Blockbuster to Netflix and be able to do that and realize that how we funded things are no longer funding, but then also have a vision to fund that future of what does it look like with a more diverse, digitized, world. And I think that's just like, we need that vision, and we need people. I don't think people are afraid to spend money if the vision feels right, And
just being willing to talk about what that vision is, and have an open mind to what somebody else's idea might be.
Yeah.
Because I think at the end of the panel on transportation, Mayor Ross was saying, we just need to get past this being rude to each other.
Yeah.
That if somebody just even brings up the idea of something that you see as being, in this category or that category, that you're just going to dig in your heels and be against it no matter what. And you're just not even going to be a polite person to that person who might be suggesting something that you have identified as something that you could just never even consider. I don't think there should be, we all have our morals and our ethics and things that we would never go across this line, but having a conversation about how to fund transit or how to fund the police should not be that a moral line that we're not willing to cross, where we demonize the other person and say that they're just a person that should not even, have a seat at the table. I think that's something to be thinking about.
Yeah. Well, that is the big story, and obviously, this is an ongoing long conversation with everyone involved here. Who cares?
Well, and I sent you a link to a page on the city's website called Connect Fort Worth, where all of the budget meetings that they're going to be having out in the community are listed. The District 9 one they had earlier, I went to that. They are also touching on the comprehensive plan at those meetings and the Move a Million plan, which is about transportation, connecting that to land use. And these are all important decisions that we should have input into because they will all impact the budget. And so if it looks like it's just a budget meeting, know that there's also going to be conversations about transportation and land use and the comprehensive plan in those meetings. And those are all your opportunities to be heard so that we can have those voices being heard and not just this is the way we've always done it and no to everything.
But let's go ahead and move into wins and losses. I'm going to start with my win and loss. My loss, I have two losses. One, really quickly, is my weekly understanding that, Mercy Culture's pastor is just a very bad person. And this guy, Landon Scott, he says voting for Democrats doesn't make you a Christian. Christian who votes for Democrats are supporting demonic policies, quote unquote, Mercy Culture lead pastor said in an Instagram post Monday. Pastor Landon Scott cited Democrat support for pro-choice policies, same-sex marriage, and so-called transgender propaganda to support his argument. Please stop pretending you're a follower of Jesus. You're simply a lukewarm, pretend Christian. These are the people who are trying to rezone so that they can help sex trafficking victims. Come on, right? Like, guys, this is bad. And so my loss is that someone like this continues to have so much red meat influence where Tim O'Hare goes and other people go to get an endorsement and a blessing. And I think this is the loss, is that you have church leaders who talk like this. And this is why you see a lot of people no longer affiliated with church. My second loss is after that is we had a feds accused former Fort Worth crypto company of defrauding clients of $5.6 million. The federal government filed a lawsuit against former Fort Worth-based crypto mining company for allegedly defrauding clients for $5.6 million. In April, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission filed a lawsuit against Geosin Mining and its co-founder Caleb Joseph Ward and Jeremy George McNutt. The lawsuit alleges that Ward and McNutt entered into agreements with around 64 investors promising to purchase, maintain, and operate mining machines. Instead, what there's sayings of a $20,000 Vegas wedding plus a $49,000 trip to Disney World. And so I just think that Fort Worth wants to lead in this crypto space. And again, how we support things like this that doesn't have a lot of accountability, yet, I can't believe these guys got funded. So actually, honestly, I think the funders deserve to lose their money because they've believed in these morons. But that's another loss, is that a crypto hit local to Fort Worth as Fort Worth tries to be a crypto city.
So my loss is very different than either of those losses. And it actually is kind of extrapolating out of an article that the Fort Worth Report wrote called Arlington Council Member Says Fall in Traffic Citations Over the Last 8 Years is Not Acceptable. And what is a loss to me in this is not so much that I think that Arlington needs to be running around writing traffic citations. Because, there's always that accusation that they're trying to make money off of people and that's why they're writing tickets. I think that people who violate traffic laws should absolutely get citations. But what this article does point out is an increase in people running red lights and that's becoming a problem. They say that there was citations kind of went down during the pandemic, and that maybe that was the explanation, but it's continued to be that way. And so now it's just not getting back to maybe citing people for things. And people's driving has gotten so bad. Like, I used to not think twice sitting at a red light that when the light turned green for me, that I was going to be safe to go through that intersection. But I do not go through a green light without looking both directions, because red light running is crazy rampant. 100%. And people do crazy things. And driving on the freeways is terrifying these days. And so, TxDOT talks about that there's 3 elements to trying to make roads safer. And one is engineering or design. One is education, and that is making sure that people follow the rules and do the right thing and know what the rules are. And the third one is enforcement. And so this is basically relying on enforcement when design or engineering and education, I think, are a little bit out of whack as well. And I don't know what the solution to this is, but I don't know if it's just my algorithm that gets all of this, but the articles lately that we have been seeing of these horrific crashes on our roadways where multiple people die, and recently a police officer died at the site of a traffic crash where the entire highway was shut down and somebody went the wrong way up an on-ramp drunk and hit him. And whole families have been wiped out in these instances. And I think a ton of it has to do with speed and impaired driving and distracted driving. And so you can't enforce your way out of that. There's got to be some other way. But the thing that pops up for me with this discussion about running red lights is that the state took away our ability to have red light cameras. So you only have the police to rely upon to actually see someone run a red light to get a citation. You can't send somebody a citation in the mail anymore based on a camera because of this whole, right to face your accuser nonsense that the state came up with.
Communism.
Oh, good God.
But a lot of the Waymo Tesla arguments they say is
they'll be safe.
That's the pro of
they are
self-driving cars.
Yes,
is that
because they follow all the rules.
Yeah, and get humans off the road. So
I would like to be a human off the road in my own single occupancy vehicle. Yeah. I would like to be on a bus or a train.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the self-driving cars. They scare me a little bit, but I don't know. I'm tired of people dying on our roadways, and this article, pointing to this concern about whether we're writing enough citations. That's not so much my complaint or it's this influx of traffic fatalities. And employing enforcement is just going to increase the need for that budget that we were just talking about. Yeah. So I don't know. I wish people would stop dying on our roadways.
Yeah. Really quick, my win is a simple one. Leon Bridges' new album comes out this week. It's called Leon. It's a commitment to Fort Worth. He's ending his tour in Fort Worth. Leon Bridges is the perfect embodiment of what Fort Worth is. I was in Las Vegas with our staff, and we had a couple new people, and one of our new people is from Columbus, Ohio, and we were just talking about artists, and he said one of his favorite artists is Leon Bridges, and I said, he's from Fort Worth, where I live, and I was like, if you like Leon Bridges, you would like Fort Worth, because his music is why Fort Worth is so amazing. Like what he says is and what he projects is the good parts of what makes Fort Worth so awesome. And so just a win that we have someone like Leon Bridges who's on a international global perspective that makes people see that this is what Fort Worth it feels like. He's a perfect embodiment.
And it's nice that we can say positive things about Fort Worth sometimes, because I think sometimes people probably think that we just sit around and complain about the things that we are trying to fix or that we think need to be fixed. But there are a lot of things about Fort Worth that we love, which is what keeps us going with all the things that we talk about. So my win is that construction is beginning on the Center Point Port Trail connecting Fort Worth to Arlington. This is a major trail development that's underway. The city council voted to approve the contract in January, and it is going to connect Far East Fort Worth and conclude in the east end of Arlington's River Legacy Trail. The trail is not far from the American Airlines headquarters, the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, and will include a 12-foot concrete multi-use path, trail structure, wide shoulders, 911 location markers, and trail signage. And you can go to the train station on your bike and catch the TRE to Fort Worth and Dallas, and then you can connect on a trail on your bike. So this is just an example of multimodal transportation and money being put into something other than highways. So I think that's great. The budget for this is $6 million, which you might think is some huge number, and people are like, $6 million. But if you go look at the articles that we shared about the budgets that have gone into highway construction, you will know that is pennies compared to what we put into our highway construction.
We got to make Aledo the center of the Metroplex, so that's why they forget all the beauty we can make in the metro that it's already have. So we will continue to fight for those things. Thank you guys. We went super, super long today, and it's been a while since we've been able to talk because we had an interview, and a lot has just happened in Fort Worth, and so we gave you a ton of different fresh perspectives. I've been doing a lot of traveling, and I think when I'm gone for work and I'm gone in other communities and areas, I just get refreshed of ideas and what things can happen in Fort Worth. So hopefully you guys got something here and you learned something. Also, shout out to the people, I don't know who you were with on Facebook, that she took a picture with. I think it was Tracy. I think her name's Clyburn. And there was a little comment about 817 Pod and who should be on the guest. And they haven't asked me to be on the guest, but we should definitely have some of those people on. Yeah. So,
absolutely.
but I thought that was cool to.
I was out peopling a lot the last couple of days. It was pretty good. The transportation thing is where Tracy and I took that selfie, but Tracy and I were together again yesterday at the Eureka Arts Ecosystem Conversation, which there's 2 opportunities left for input on that as well through a couple of dates in September. So look that up as well.
Awesome. Take care, everyone.